at the wake of a crisis. It's unknown. The unknown can be an enemy of transparency, but it can also mean mystery. Mystery can breed curiosity, and curiosity may bloom into revelation. Revelation in the arms of the gospel that radiates hope. And hope brings joy.
My name is Caitlin Lopez, and I am a speech-language pathologist currently serving students in Compton Unified School District. I have been an SLP for about the last 8 years, and primarily working with children with disabilities. So I am a neurotypical able-bodied female, which means that I'm actually not an expert in this. There are people whose voices should be heard, but what I can speak to is that my life is more full and richer because of people with disabilities. So today we're going to dive into ableism, values, the hope that kind of exists within ableism, inclusion, and then what that means for a church community. A little caveat here is that there are lots of disabilities. We have autism spectrum disorder, we have Down syndrome, we have blindness, we have deafness and hard of hearing, there is a physical disability. There are so many different sub-communities within this large overarching disability kind of umbrella, if you will. Just kind of keep that in mind as we go forward and we start talking about things. Ableism is the last socially acceptable prejudice. So what is it exactly? It's a set of beliefs or practices that devalues and discriminates against people with intellectual, physical, and or psychiatric disabilities. It rests on this idea that the disabled person must be fixed in one form or another. The main thing to think about here is how do we judge value, and then how do we convey that value? Ableism is this idea that a person with a disability is not valued. We know that making fun of a disabled person, that's not cool. We shouldn't do that. We don't use the R word anymore. That's not okay. But ableism still shows up in our society in a myriad of ways. Like I said before, the main thing that we should do, or our check for ourselves, is how are we judging another person, and then how are we conveying that value? When children are curious, how do we respond? Do we overcompensate or maybe speak down to somebody with a disability? And then this idea of the hero complex. So I'm going to dive into each of these a little bit deeper. So when children are curious, that's a good thing, and we should absolutely cultivate that curiosity. But sometimes it can get a little awkward. We see somebody in a wheelchair, and if you are a parent of a small child, you know that this may happen. They might point and ask, why is he in a wheelchair? Or why does he sound like that? How we respond is really where the ableism exists, not so much in the child's curiosity, but in how we respond. Do we respond with shame and, no, don't point, that's rude? Or do we respond continuing to convey value towards that person? What I mean is, oh, well, we're all made differently. You have blonde hair, I have brown hair. Just like this person has a wheelchair and your legs are walking, he's able to move around in his wheelchair. It's okay to point out differences, but it's just how we point out these things, how we explain them to kids. And then also maybe you start to include a little bit more of the exploration at home. Teach them it's okay to be curious. It's okay to talk to people that are different than them. Another way that ableism shows up, we see this a lot within the autism community. Somebody with autism might be nonverbal, but that doesn't mean they're non-intellectual. And often what will happen is we quit talking to them and we start talking to their caregiver, and we don't ever make eye contact again or direct any questions to somebody with a disability. Sometimes it'll show up in us talking a little slower and louder and maybe using smaller words. That's not helpful either. We have to assume that they're competent and not talk down to them. Nonverbal doesn't mean non-intellectual. And then the last way that it shows up, and I think that this is something that we don't often think about, is this idea of the hero complex. Right around this time, as kind of prom is happening, is we'll start to see these videos of the prom queen going and asking a young man with Down syndrome to prom. We talk about, oh, it's so touching, he's so amazing, she's so amazing. The king or queen asking the person with Down syndrome to prom. Yeah, that's kind. However, what is the value that we are conveying about that person with the disability? Are we saying that this prom king or prom queen was burdened by having to go with this person? Were we saying that's a good thing that they asked them because they weren't able to get a date on their own? So those are things that we need to start thinking about. How are we conveying value about people who are not like us? As we talk about ableism, and we know it exists, but what does it have to do with the church? Well, the latest numbers coming out of the CDC are that 1 in 4 adults have a disability. And remember, this can be wide-ranging. It can be physical, it can be intellectual, it can be psychiatric. The latest numbers coming out about children are 17% of children have a developmental disability. That means 17 kids out of 100 kids are going to have a disability. So when we take a look at these numbers and we compare them to our communities, whether that's our social group, our church community, do those numbers add up? Do these CDC numbers look like the numbers that show up in our communities? And chances are they probably don't. And that kind of bums me out. Not because I feel like we need to serve this community, but because we, as neurotypical, able-bodied people, are missing out on a whole community of people that exist. Like I said, my life is richer because of people with disabilities. I have been included in the autism community through different experiences I've had, and it's a whole new family that I'm so grateful that I have. And I've learned alongside them, I've learned from them, and I'm so grateful for that. So what does this have to do with church? Like I said, our numbers probably don't look like this, which means that we can all stand to be a little bit more inclusive. The gospel of Jesus is inclusive. It's for everybody. And as we look at Jesus' time on earth, he stood with people in the margins. So what do we do right now? We start to ask questions. When we don't know something, what do? We ask questions. And who are the experts in the room? The experts in the room are the people who are living the experience. So start to ask people that you know with a disability. If you don't know somebody with a disability, we will get to that. And I'm sorry about that, but we'll get there. So you start to ask the people in your community with the disability. First of all, I know a big thing right now is we're so afraid of offending people. I like to come back to Maya Angelou's quote, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. And I think that that is something that is really important as we kind of move forward. Change is awkward. We're afraid of offending people, but that's where when you're in relationship with people, there's a lot more grace. As you move to building these relationships with people, you can start to ask them, what is it that you want to be called? Language is so important, how we convey meaning. So I know this sub-community of people with Down syndrome and a lot of families that I work with that have kids with autism, they like this idea of people first language. So it's my son with Down syndrome, my daughter with autism. So the idea is you're focusing on the whole person and then they just happen to have this disability. Also within that sub-community of autism, there are people that don't see any shame in having autism or being autistic. So they will just straight up tell you, I'm autistic. That can also be the case within physical disabilities. There's no shame in having a disability. So they would rather say that they are disabled versus differently abled. That's another phrase that kind of pops around in this overarching community. It's important. Go and ask those in your community, what do you want to be called? Chances are, because there's so many different disabilities, you're going to have different ideas within your larger community. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with it. So that's the first thing. Ask these people. And then you can start to ask them too, what are possible barriers for you? I like to think of this as if you're inviting people over to your house for lunch or dinner, you find out, What is okay for everybody to eat? And then you make sure that there's something at the table for everyone. Do you spend the entire meal talking about the food choices that you've prepared for everyone? Not at all. You talk about the latest promotion or the newest baby that's sitting around the table. We don't often talk about these things. It's the same thing. So you can start to ask people within your community what are possible barriers, or you can be proactive and start thinking about these possible barriers that might be included within your church. So a not so fun fact: churches do not have to be ADA compliant. ADA stands for Americans with Disabilities Act of 1992, that people with disabilities fought for, making different places compliant for them. If you see the kind of those dips in the curve of a crosswalk, the crosswalk telling you like walk, that's ADA compliant. If you see Braille at the bank, that's ADA compliant. So the crazy thing is, in the late 80s, early 90s, churches fought this. They did not want to be ADA compliant. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't be. So as you start to walk around your church, notice, are there physical barriers that somebody with different abilities or a disabled person would have trouble getting into your church service? Are there ways that you can make your church service more auditory if somebody has a visual impairment? You can make your church service more visual if somebody has an auditory impairment. Autism, there can be a lot of sensory issues. So how can we make our church services a little bit more sensory friendly? Or maybe if our church services aren't, can we provide things that will help with that? These are just some of the different questions that we can start to ask ourselves as we go forward. Another really important thing to think about is, do we include people with disabilities in our worship service? And I don't just mean do we include them, they're sitting there in the pew singing and praying and listening. I mean, do we include them up front? Are they visual for all to see? Are we able to convey that meaning of this person is important and they deserve to hold space in front of all of us, whether they're offering prayer or special music or whatever it is that your church does? Another thing that I think is so important is, do we ask people with disabilities to volunteer? A true relationship is a give and take. It's not just us giving and serving. That's not true relationship. True relationship is this give and take. So if we really do value and honor people with disabilities, we want them in the trenches right there with us. It's really important to ask them, hey, have you thought about volunteering? What ministries are you excited about that you want to get involved in? And then as we start to do this and we really start to include people within our church service, I want to steal this phrase from the Lucky Few of shifting the narrative. And I think that's so beautiful. We start to shift the narrative of, yes, they are worthy, and yes, they absolutely deserve to take up space, when we allow them to take up space, when we invite them, when we beg them to be a part of church service. Another question that we need to ask ourselves is how we evaluate the success of a church service, or even of the church community. What are the things that we are going to place the highest value on? Are we going to place the highest value on how many people are sitting in the church, or how perfectly timed a church service was, or the diversity of the people that are included and the depth of the relationships that are there? Another really important piece is, I have worked in children's ministry for as long as I can remember, is, this idea of what does a successful Sabbath school lesson look like, right? I mean, kids, it's just like organized chaos. And so the relationships that are built in that Sabbath school class are so important. I know the work of Kara Powell in Sticky Faith. She talks about the research of what makes kids stick in church, and it's simply that of relationships. So I think that's something that we can do a lot better, is equipping our Sabbath school teachers to work with lots of different types of kids and to have fun and love whoever comes into their classroom. So a couple of years ago, I had the awesome experience of being an adjunct clinical supervisor for University of Redlands. I would observe speech pathology students working with kids or their clients. There was this family there that I had gotten to know. One day, I had left my viewing room to go give information to somebody, and I came back, and there was kind of this music. As I came in, I heard this music and I was like, oh no, I left my phone on. And then I realized that it was this one particular girl with Down syndrome that was singing this song. At the end of her session, I walked out and I said, hey, I love that song you were singing. Where did you learn it? And she goes, oh, church. She kept walking down the way. And her mom was a little bit behind her, and she stopped and she said, "What? What was she singing?" And I said, "I don't know, it was like a Bethel song maybe." And the mom goes, "Church." And she got these tears in her eyes, and she said, "We haven't been to church since 3 years old." And this girl was now 17. And she said, "Church was so important to us. We were so dedicated, went on the mission trips, gave our tithe diligently." And she said, "I went to go pick her up, and they said she is not allowed back in this room without an adult." And it hurt her and her husband so much that they haven't stepped foot back in a church again. That kind of started to get me thinking, they can't be the only family. And at the time, I was working in children's ministry. And so we created this program called Sidekicks. If you have a kid with a disability, you can contact our children's ministry department and we would set you up with 2 sidekicks. Because every superhero needs a sidekick was kind of the idea behind it. The sidekicks were given the family's contact info and vice versa. And if you wanted to go to church that weekend, you would contact your sidekicks and say, "Hey, we're going to be there this weekend. Who can make it?" And the sidekicks would work it out with their own schedules. "Oh, I'll be there." Their only job was to help facilitate relationships, to be an extra adult in the room. Their job was not to do the craft for the student. Their job was not to hold their hand the entire time. Their job was literally just to be a shadow and to be of assistance to the teacher and to help facilitate relationships between their superhero and any other children. We found that it was valuable to families who had been turned away from church. There was another family that said, "Oh, when we saw this on the website, we knew that this is where we would feel welcome." But the most cool thing that happened was I was regularly teaching in the kindergarten class at that time. And there was a family that actually didn't sign up for sidekicks. They had a son. He had disabilities. He wore a helmet. So you would look at him and you would know that he had disabilities. Kids in that kindergarten class, I don't think they'd ever really been exposed to somebody who was different than them in that way. They were a little standoffish at first. Our little friend Donald, he was kind of aggressive and kind of a bull in a china cabinet, but he was so awesome. You knew exactly what he was feeling and when he was feeling it because everything was like right there out in the open, which I loved. I just remember I had this box and there were marbles in the middle, and Donald's hand goes and grabs the marbles, all of them. Jojo, this other kid who's like all about justice, he was like, "Teacher, he can't do that." And I said, "Okay, well then can you help him? What do we do?" And he looked at him and he goes, "Donald, you need to let go of the marbles." So Donald looked at him, dropped the marbles, and then Jojo, you could see his eyes like, what just happened? And so as time went on, you started to see Jojo's world open up a little bit more. Things weren't quite so black and white. Donald was kind of fitting in this gray area that didn't really make sense. A couple months after that, Jojo comes in with an invitation to his birthday party. He's giving them to the different kids, and he gives one to Donald. And as he gives it to Donald, he goes, "Here, friend." What more can you ask for? So do I think that it was awesome for Donald to be in our class for Donald's benefit? Not necessarily. I mean, Donald was kind of like happy-go-lucky, whatever. Like he would have been fine in any situation. But for Donald to be with Jojo, I think it was Jojo's world who changed the most. And that's really where the power of inclusion lies. And that's really where that give and take starts to happen. I volunteer with a group that takes kids with autism surfing, and one of my favorite parts of that day is you watch parents come in who are so used to watching their kids being judged and their kind of shoulders are up near their ears. And as the day goes on, their shoulders start to drop and they realize they're just among family. And I think that's one of the coolest things. And that's one of the things we wanted to harbor within our ministry of sidekicks, is to let the families know you are loved and you are here to support each other, and we're here to learn from you how best to support your kids and develop better relationships. As we kind of have gone through this of ableism, inclusion, what do we do now? You start to ask those questions to get the answers. Sidekicks, I have that as a resource for your church if you're interested. I'd be more than happy to come talk with you about how we can make this work. How we can better train our Sabbath school leaders to be better equipped to deal with kids who process a little bit differently. The whole goal here is how do we be more inclusive? How do we really start to represent what the kingdom of heaven looks like? So I'm going to leave you guys with a video that really I should have just played for you guys from the beginning, because it kind of talks about inclusion the best way and it's super awesome. So enjoy.
People with Down syndrome have special needs. Special needs? Really? It would be special if people with Down syndrome needed to eat dinosaur eggs. That would be special.
1 dinosaur egg. Enjoy.
Man, I think you were totally right about Lindsay.
If we need to wear a giant suit of armor, that would be special.
I got a condo in Manhattan. Baby girl, what's happening? So gonna get to clapping. Go pop a phone.
It would be special if we needed to be massaged by a cat. If we needed to be woken up by a celebrity.
Wakey, wakey, eggs and bakey. How are you? You may know me from Scrubs or Office Space. Your darker flicks, The Rock, Platoon, Wall Street. Funny story, I played Ben.
Get out.
My bad.
That would be special. But what we really need is education, jobs, and opportunities, friends, and some love. Just like everybody else. Are these needs special?
Everyone, we are here with Caitlin Lopez, and she's here to answer some questions with us. Hi, Caiti. Well, I know that you wanted to make a quick clarification, if you want to say that real quick. All right, thank you. That was probably my fault for saying that. So I have a question for you. How do you make friends with someone with a disability? Well, I would think that every community has something, right? Some kind of program. So,
School districts like the Challenger Sports Program. So that's, like your football, your cheerleading, your soccer, your baseball. That was like special needs coaching and stuff like that. So that was really cool.
So I was just getting a text right now saying that people can't hear you, but they can hear me. So I can't summarize what you've said, but as well as you've been saying it, but she's talking about all these different ways in your community that you can reach out and find people with disabilities. She even has this amazing, she goes surfing. Was it once a year? Is that what you said?
We do it the organization goes all year round, and they go all over the world, Hawaii, California, all up and down the East Coast. And they just do 3 camps here in SoCal. So.
Awesome. Well, I've just been told that we can hear you now. so yeah, if you want to ask her that question again, you're welcome to. Another question that I wanted to ask you is, you mentioned something about sensory issues. What does that mean?
Yeah, so sensory, people with autism, they will either be hypersensitive to whatever sensory input we get, whether that's tactile, anything that's touching us, sound, they might be able to hear that like electricity buzz, of the refrigerator, or the, I'm trying to think of what those lights are called, like in classrooms, those really bright lights. They can hear that buzz, and it will drive, they are hyper focused on that. So that would be like a sensory issue, bright lights, big sounds, tactile. And then there's also the other side of like hyposensitive, where they need a lot to feel it, sort of thing. So those are things to think about, as you're getting ready for your church service. There are churches with lots of loud music and lights and that kind of thing. So what can we do to maybe, give a sensory kit to people, whether that's like, earphones or earplugs, sunglasses, things like that. First, if you're going to have loud things or whatever. So yeah, those are things to think about. And that's what sensory issues mean, or sensory sensitivities mean.
So you mentioned earlier how it's kind of hard to build relationships right now because of COVID. Is there some ways that we can build relationships right now during this time? If you know people that are, have a disability. So the crazy thing is, and I've seen this a lot on social media, is, this idea of we're socially distant, but people with disabilities are kind of socially distant all the time. If you think about it, their segregation still exists in the public school system. We have the special ed classrooms way in the back of the school, and those kids are never really included in things that happen. There are those of us who are working hard to make sure that we can be more inclusive. But that's something to think about, as we go forward, is how can we be more inclusive of all? So if you have somebody in your life that has a disability, check in on them just like you would check in on anybody else. That's something that I think people don't necessarily think about, is how do you make friends with somebody with disability? Same way you make friends with anybody else. You look for those commonalities. You look for, if there's a San Francisco Giants fan and I see somebody wearing a hat, I'm going to say, hey, crazy, you're in enemy country and you're fans too. We need to bound together or whatever. Same thing. Wait. You're a San Francisco Giants. Wait, what? And you're in LA? Okay. I'm sorry, Pono, but she needs to go.
You just look for those commonalities, and that's what we all build our friendships off of. And you start the same way you would start with, anything else is, hey, how's it going? My name's Caiti.
I wasn't able to watch all of your video because I had to be on earlier here. Did you talk anything about how we talk about people with disabilities, how we can be more inclusive and aware of what we're saying so it's not offensive?
Yeah, I did say a little bit about that. I was talking about how, there's so many different ways to talk about people with disabilities. And the best thing to do is basically, as you're talking with somebody with disabilities, if we're in relationship with each other, I'm not going to be as offended, right? Oh, you said, so if you're in relationship with each other, you're not going to be as offended. The grace is there. So start with the relationship. And then ask somebody, what is it that you want to be called? I had mentioned, people with autism, they'll just say, I'm autistic, I am disabled. There's no shame in that. And that's what, kind of makes them more unique and more special in that way. So then there are people that do want like that people first language of, I'm a person that happens to have Down syndrome. So those are just things to think about.
Yeah, I think a lot of churches are hesitant to start ministries because they don't know how. Mm-hmm. Can people talk to you about this? Is there a way? What does that look like? Even if they can't talk to you right now, what would be your suggestion for the first 2 or 3 steps? And then when they're able to connect with you, you can kind of guide them along the way. What would be your suggestion?
I would say just start asking those questions. Like I had mentioned, what is it that we can do to include people? Start asking questions about your own congregation. Are we going to be okay with being uncomfortable? Are we going to be okay with, are we warm people? Are we ready to be with people that look different, act different than us? I mean, and this is like in every realm, not just people with disabilities. So that's something to think about. And then start thinking about, what resources are available. Sidekicks actually doesn't really cost a lot of money. You just have to have the manpower in a sense. And you have to have people that just love other people regardless of, what difference they may or may not have. So those are things that I would definitely encourage people to do. Ask the questions, look at your resources, look at, what you can do now. And if they have more questions, this is my favorite thing in the entire world. So I would love to talk to people more.
Well, my undergrad was in English, so I love talking about books with people, but not a lot of people like to talk about books. So I totally get what you're saying about, I just love talking about this. Please ask me questions about this. So I'm just going to throw this out here. If people want to talk to you, they should message us on Facebook, and we'll make sure to connect you guys. So if you want to start this ministry, if you want to ask Caitlin more questions about what it looks like, she's excited about this, guys. So bother her, please. What are you doing right now that schools are closed? What are you up to?
So I'm Zooming a lot. Our school district actually contracted with another company that does teletherapy. So I haven't necessarily been serving students, but I have been creating materials for students and getting them to them. A lot of parent education, a lot of meetings. So we only have a few days left of school, and then I'm looking forward to turning off my computer this summer.
I totally hear you. After looking at a screen for too long, your brain just starts to go to mush. Is there anything else that you can think of that we need to know? Anything that maybe you forgot to add in your video that you think really needs to be shared?
It's so hard. Like this, I'm sure people as they're watching kind of get the sense of this is only 20 minutes of diving into something that is so deep, and there's so much information. I am just so excited that we're starting the conversation, and that hopefully you can start the conversation at your local church and start to figure out what works for your local church. How can we just be more inclusive, and how can we make our churches actually look like the kingdom of heaven?
Amen. I love that. That's awesome. I'm going to just take 1 second and scroll and see if there's any more questions that are up here.
Donovan said church training sessions. I'm cheap. I will come.
By cheap, does that mean free?
Yeah, it does. It does.
Okay, I'm going to say this for you. I'm going to be your advocate. If you ask her to come, you need to feed her well, all right? It is all about the good food. Otherwise, she's not coming. Oh, man. Caitlin, thank you so much. I really want to thank you. And this is not in the program, but I was wondering if I could pray for you and this ministry and for our churches. God, I thank you so much for Caitlin and what she has shared with us today. I thank you that this ministry that she started, that she did start, was so powerful. And I pray that it would start to to reach other churches, Lord. And as we are contemplating in our own lives and in our own churches and our own ministries, God, I pray that you would convict us, that you would direct us, and show us what we can do to better serve your kingdom and to better serve all of your people. I pray that you would help us to have a welcoming, loving atmosphere whenever people step on our church campuses or even in our homes, Lord, that they know that they are loved and that they are welcomed. I thank you, God, for what you're doing, and I pray that you continue to push our buttons a little bit so that we know that we need to start moving it forward in faith, stepping out in faith and serving this community especially, Lord. And we thank you, God, that you are at work and that we just have so much more that we can do and gain, and we praise you and we thank you that you are with us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Sarah.